the story is not yet written. I'd like to think that, you and I are both still young, pretty young. There's plenty of road left to travel.
We still got a chance.
That's right. No, not only
45.
There's reason. Oh man, well shoot, you're not even at the 50-yard line, brother. That's what I'd say. But I do want to jump on this question of the symmetry or the asymmetry between the two sides, because you raise a really interesting point, and I have no problem conceding that there is this sort of this culture of not wanting to tolerate certain points of view and opinions on the left, and it manifests in some very particular and conspicuous ways. And I want to circle in on that a little bit in just a second. But I do want to tell you, I think without necessarily suggesting a strict sort of, equality of this phenomenon on both sides. And by the way, this is something I would say to somebody on the other side too, because for me at least, it's not necessarily the main point. But I was just in Orlando at a sort of a conservative event, and I was in Florida, and I happened to have a long conversation with David French, who's a bit of a friend of mine and so forth. And, David is an interesting guy because I don't know if you know David, but, you speak.
Not personally, but I know who he is, of course.
Yes, indeed. Well, somebody of deep principle, deep conviction, at least I would represent him that way. Somebody who's very educated and scholarly with a strong commitment to conservative principles, who happens to be somebody who had serious disagreements with President Trump's, supporters, and somebody who doesn't really agree with the whole kind of like suite of left-wing analysis on race, but who sees some legitimacy in what he thinks is trying to be communicated by phrases like systemic racism and so forth. But French, on account of his disagreement with Donald Trump and, on account of, some of the sympathetic attitudes he takes on some of the racial matters, and particularly, this era of CRT and so forth. And it's not just French. I mean, look, you've got this whole, cluster of moderate Republicans and so forth who did kind of dissent from the Trump supporting mainstream. A lot of folks, you can find folks on the right who feel not just disagreed with, but out and out sort of disrespected and dismissed by the folks who they had considered to be their camp, while at the same time, they find some folks on the left who are saying, look, we disagree with you guys on a lot of things, but we respect your character, we respect your willingness to see where we're coming from, and we can work together and so forth. And so I point this out just to make the point that, again, not saying that it's necessarily an equal proportion phenomenon on each side, between the two sides, but that there is nevertheless a phenomenon in American life that has to be engaged, wherein we all could do a hell of a lot better than we're doing in terms of setting the stage for constructive disagreement to take place. Because so long as we say that, look, the other side is 65 or 75%, wrong, and I've got the rest of it, and therefore I don't need to make 1% effort to go the extra mile to be able to rebuild these relationships, I don't see how we leave a democracy that functions to the next generation. And so that's kind of like my message for both sides, ultimately, is that whatever you think the balance there is, we all need to do more if we're leading with goodwill to be able to reset the field for the American people to have the right kind of conversations in the way that you guys modeled, the way you've modeled, Dave, in your career, I think, in those points that inspired me and so many people like me.
So you hit a bunch of stuff there. So I would say first, in terms of the heart of what you just said, I'm with you. I think I'm with you. I completely hear you. On the asymmetry part, I also agree that there is an asymmetry problem where the left has a more hysterical version of this. But let's whittle down what you just said about the right, that there are the guys, sort of the never Trumpers, I think is what you're saying. So now I wouldn't, you referred to them as the moderate conservatives. I wouldn't use that term moderate, because I actually think that for the most part, the Trump Republicans were the moderate ones. I don't know what sort of radical right-wing position came out of sort of the Trump machine, putting aside his personality and the tweets and all that. He was fairly moderate. I was actually making an argument before the election saying that in many ways, Donald Trump was defending conservatism and liberalism. He was defending conservatism in a very obvious way, right? Like he was appointing conservative judges. That's like the most conservative thing you can do. I also felt he was defending liberalism because he was attacking the illiberal forces of the progressive movement. And I felt that tension, Jordan would often talk about this, and he would do this with his hands. A healthy society wants the tension between conservatism and liberalism. Now,
yeah, right.
Now, so I don't think that those.
Ben
So
Carson
if you take,
said that you need two wings to fly, as I recall.
exactly that's exactly it. And as far as the moderate, what you're calling the moderate Republicans, but sort of these never Trump people, I think the frustration that the Trump people had with them, and I'm very sympathetic to this, by the way, is that these guys, say the David French, Max Boot, this kind of more like Beltway swamp type Republican. And again, I've never met David. I'm sure he's a decent guy and everything you said about him is true. And I know him to be a thoughtful writer and all of that stuff. So this is not an attack on his character in any way. I think the anger from the people on the right was, oh, you guys might be right about a couple things. You might be, but you will always lose. And you hate the guy who's willing to do the stuff to win. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument because, it's not just in a American sense, Republicans versus Democrats. It's Republicans versus Democrats and the media and big tech. And Trump was willing to fight all those things. Now, it doesn't mean you have to love him, and it doesn't mean you have to love his personality and all the rest of that stuff. But he was willing to do the dirty work so that there could be some wins. And I think the frustration from his supporters towards that crew that you're talking about is like, you know what, you guys are kind of right about stuff, but you're ineffectual. You're sort of Mitt Romney. You'll never really do anything. Republicans tried to do it with Mitt Romney, who, Mitt Romney, most people would say he's probably a decent human being, but, when he ran against Obama, he was a racist. He had a binder full of women, so he hated women, blah, blah, blah. John McCain, of course, was a racist. Now they used to hate George W. Bush. He was the devil. Now they kind of like him because he doesn't like Trump. So Trump was willing to go all the way. He was willing to look at the road and go, I will go to the end of the road and do what I got to do to win, because politics is messy and dirty and gross and all of that stuff. And these other guys, they sort of take this position like, oh, no, we're the principled conservatives. But, if you're the principled conservative who's standing on the Titanic as it's sinking, it's not that great. It's not that great. I'd rather be the guy who is, getting people onto the lifeboat and figuring out where to go after that. Yeah. So I'm sympathetic to the frustrations that those people had. Doesn't mean they all behave perfectly, and certainly on Twitter, they absolutely don't. But I would add this. I spoke 2 or 3 years ago at Liberty University. It is the largest evangelical college in the United States, of course, founded by Jerry Falwell. If you would listen to what mainstream would tell you about evangelicals, and certainly Liberty University, they hate gay people, they hate liberals, blah, all this stuff. I went there at Convocation. It's their Sunday event where they do, a prayer event, and then they bring on a speaker. 14,000 people. It was the biggest event I've ever done. It felt like a true political rally. 14,000 people. That's a tremendous amount of people. I talked about being married to a man. I talked about being pro-choice. I got a standing ovation. And when I walked around campus that day, I had countless amount of kids shaking my hand, hugging me, taking selfies, et cetera, et cetera. That tells you about the malleability that I talked about earlier, that there is something broadly good happening over here. Now, you show me where, imagine it this way. Let's try it this way. Imagine Bill Maher, who's been the standard bearer of liberalism in America for 30 years. Imagine Bill Maher showing up to a lefty college, say Berkeley. Imagine who would be attacking Bill Maher if he did that. Would it be the people on the right? No. Actually, some of them would go and go, Bill Maher's pretty good on speech, so free speech. So we're going to go listen. But they certainly wouldn't shout him down. The people going to destroy Bill Maher would be the lefties, even though he's been a liberal for 30 years. And that's why their illiberalism is the biggest threat to liberalism. Conservatism is no longer a threat to liberalism. It's the illiberalism of the progressives.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, look, let me pull out something extremely real that I see you voicing, that I hear you voicing here, which is a couple of things. One, starting with this, this fact, and I actually do think that this is true, that sort of the predominating institutions in mainstream American life are very much tilted in a certain ideological and political direction, namely the left, right?
Sure.
And there's plenty of diversity on the left, but broadly speaking, I would say that the media, the mainstream media leans left, the college campuses lean left. Even corporate America, which you would have always sort of considered to be, of course, more right-leaning as an internal cultural matter, itself, at least in terms of how it interacts with, the entertainment industry, how it advertises and so forth, seems to bend over backwards to appeal to socially progressive sensibilities, and the internal governance of organizations, as is perhaps evidenced by the proliferation of certain types of diversity and equity inclusion works in corporations and whatnot, shows that there's serious cultural momentum, social momentum in a leftward direction within America's institutions. And so Donald Trump arises in the American political scene, I think, as a gladiator who's willing to just step dead center into the arena and make no apologies for fighting back against some of those trends with brute rhetorical force.
Yes.
So, as a matter of fact, Victor Davis Hanson described, he had an interesting way of explaining, his appreciation for Donald Trump. I don't know how big a John Wayne fan you are, Dave, but I'm a big John Wayne fan. My father is a big John Wayne fan, and we love the movie The Searchers. I don't know if you ever saw The Searchers.
I don't know if I have, actually.
Yeah, John Wayne played a guy who was a former Confederate officer who went back to his hometown in Texas after having been kicked out of the force or kicked out of the armed forces for some reason. And basically, he had I think he had a niece who was kidnapped by an Indian tribe, and he had to go save the niece. And he was a crook himself. He was a criminal. He was somebody who you didn't want to invite to a polite dinner and so forth. But Victor Davis Hanson's argument was that at the end of the day, only a guy like that could get the job done and do what needed to be done. And that's what I hear you sort of articulating here, that like we're just in a place where you needed somebody who was, even if he broke a few things, was willing to fight the fight that needed to be fought. And for me,
John, also think about it this way. I think we're both in agreement that politics is messy. Politics is kind of corrupt. Media makes it corrupt. Like the whole thing's screwy. Well, what kind of decent, truly decent, honest, forthright human being could become president of the United States at this point? Even putting aside Trump for a second, like try to paint what that person would be. Even the fact that we have Joe Biden as president. Now, I don't particularly like Joe Biden. I think he has severe cognitive problems. I think this Afghanistan thing is an absolute disaster. I think he's appointed some pretty terrible people. And I think almost everything in America is collapsing because of him and whoever's sort of pulling the strings behind him. I don't know if it's the Obama machine or what. But the point is, they could only choke out Biden because that's the best the system could give. The system could give you a 50-year veteran politician who had already been VP, who was out of the way, but he's been in it long enough that that's just the best we could choke out, this 78-year-old guy who doesn't really stand for anything. Try to imagine. I mean, it's really hard to imagine a good, decent, honest person saying, no, I'll run for president.
Well, can I say something about that, Dave?
Sure.
Let me just jump in there really quick to say, I think that if we want to go down the road of talking about the problems with the overarching sort of like system and structure of the way we elect people, the expectations from the way the media operates, the way the parties operate, and so on and so forth, that sort of puts the selection pressure to bear in a way that cancels out the possibility that you're going to get somebody like that who's respected by both sides and able to demonstrate that. I mean, I'm with you all the way. And in a big way, that's also the part of the work of Braver Angels too, is to not only model the goodwill, but to provide structures for people to organize and meet each other so that we can ultimately begin to influence a change in the way the culture of our institutions works from the demand level up. So I'm with you 100% on that point.
Yeah.
And by the way, I do want to come on top of this really quick, Dave, to make, an argument that I really want people to hear, because I respect everything that you just said about, Donald Trump and, not just you, but Victor Davis Hanson, my dad, right? Because I think my dad would echo you 100% as to, why it needed to be Trump, right? As I said, I'm a student of or I try to be a student of the philosophy of nonviolence and so forth. And I say this just to articulate a philosophical starting point, not to like set up a contrast for debate and so forth so much, but to make the point that Dr. King said that we must accomplish peace by means of peace, right? That ultimately the ends must be achieved in ways that are consistent with the means, and that the means must be consistent with the ends. And I think that what you're speaking to in, the fact that the system is just set up to prevent that from happening is absolutely vital observation. But so long as that is the case, though, I do think that we need to think creatively, all of us, about how we ultimately create the landscape for that to change. And so, I do think that there's a reason why I'm going to tie a couple things together here. I do think there's a reason why you have this particular sort of energy on the left, wherein, and it's relatively recent, as I think you'll agree with me. And Jonathan Haidt will pin this to like 2013 specifically in terms of college campuses and so forth, where there's this understanding of free speech is something that, in contrast to so much of history, is today at least not so much a tool of the people who are oppressed by American society, but a tool of the people who want to preserve the patriarchy and so forth, white supremacist kind of structure. And on the one hand, from a traditional reading of history, it's like, well, how on earth could that be the case? But one thing that I try to shine a light on in my work, and you and I talked a little bit about this when we had coffee the other week. I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal that a few people may have read, and I've made this kind of point elsewhere. Where look, I'm a Black American, I'm biracial American, but half Anglo and half African American. But I'm African American. I would have been a slave during slavery for sure, right? And I've lived this life that is nothing but the American dream. But on the other hand, I do think. And not just think, but I think I know, on the basis of my own personal experience, not just looking at my mother's family, but having married a woman from the Jordan Downs projects in Watts, that the Black experience, just to speak about the Black community in particular, because the Black experience has a lot to do with animating, I think, the larger kind of like, or at least how people interpret the Black experience has a lot to do with animating the political language on the left in many respects. There are in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, it's useful context, Jim Crow segregation was defeated. The right to access the ballot was won. But most people already had the same level of voting rights as far as Black Americans were concerned. In the North, Black people in the North weren't dealing with Jim Crow segregation. It was a minority of folks whose material circumstances really affected by the Civil Rights Movement. Many people would be integrated into mainstream American institutions from the Black community and would develop the sort of success that made my life possible. But many, many more folks continued to be locked into a situation where suddenly not only do you have from a conservative critical perspective or from a conservative perspective, the undermining impact of, let's say, the welfare state and so forth on the formation of the Black family, sort of developing a relationship with the public benefit system that could be undermining of individual initiative, but also the advent of heroin and crack cocaine, the following of the mass incarceration phenomenon on top of that for people who are already poor, who had lost their leadership, and for people whose memories of all of American history went from Jim Crow, obviously the racism of the 60s and the 50s, back to the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, back to the Civil War and slavery, and then going forward from that post-civil rights period of time, are still in the hood, are being arrested at a rapid rate, are still not experiencing economic equality. And you fast forward to the 90s with the Rodney King riots and so forth, and you go over just a little course of time, it's hard to see where the American dream ever shows up for a lot of these folks. But as American society becomes more integrated, that understanding of American history suddenly is being articulated more forcefully within the institutions, within the corporations, within the universities and so forth. And I think part of what we're actually feeling, like in the media conversations and so forth, is sort of the outer ripples of what are actually really intense and important conversations that are grounded in some reality in the inner circles of some of these engagements. And look, there are all sorts of charlatans and opportunists and people who want to take that social energy and wrap it up into political clubs that dumb down the conversation and keep us from communicating. But when I speak to conservative audiences, Dave, a big part of what I try to do is communicate the idea of that, look, beneath all of the craziness, there's still some human experience that we've got to be able to understand and empathize with. We've got to be able to show some love to these people in order to gain some trust and the basis for goodwill and democracy. And when I'm talking to the never Trumpers, as well as liberals and progressives and Democrats, I make the point that, look, you guys may hate Donald Trump, but if we want a society of love and goodwill, let me just point a little thing out. Donald Trump uses the word love more than any politician I have ever seen on the campaign trail. I've been to a Trump event or two. Donald Trump, for all of his flaws, for all of his shortcomings, showed more love to his base of supporters than any Republican politician, much less any Democratic, mainstream politician ever had before him. And that's important because these are disenfranchised poor people too. These are poor white folks in Appalachia. These are people who don't have opportunities in the Rust Belt dealing with opioid addiction and the abandonment of the mainstream cultural and institutional forces of our society, not just in the leftward direction that we illustrated before, but even among establishment Republicans that left them feeling orphaned by the people who were supposed to represent them. And by the way, Dave, these two camps, poor Black people, poor white people, people forgotten by mainstream America as we sit comfortable in our middle class and upper class affluence and so forth, were precisely the constituencies that Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to unite and bring together at the end of his life. He sought to organize Black people who were victims of segregation and Jim Crow, just as he was seeking to organize poor white folks in Appalachia who were dying in poverty. And I think that if we can empathize and love people in identifying their true human suffering across the spectrum, that we can still build the America that I think you and I, Dave, both want to see. And so, that's the pitch, my friend.